Hello, everyone, and welcome to Esoterica's The Interview. Today, I am very excited to introduce you to Bruce Farrell Rosen. Bruce Farrell Rosen is joining us from San Francisco, and he is the author of, if you can see this screen, Bombed in His Bed, The Confessions of a Jewish Gangster, Myer Rush. Now, Bruce has a very unique connection to the gangster Myer Rush because Bruce is his nephew and interviewed him over many years and grew up in the shadow of this notorious gangster who was bombed in his bed. I mean, what a great title. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you for having me, Leah.
So, God he's Jewish, so yeah, God comes to mind. So tell me, you grew up kind of hearing about Myer Rush. Like, what were the family stories like? How did you first come in contact with this idea of this personality?
Well, I was born in Toronto, and our family brought us out to California when I was about 3.5 or 4 years old, and we're talking late 50s. And so the rest of the family grew up, the cousins, all the others, excuse me, grew up getting to know Myer and, constantly reading about his events and his escapades and his tales as written about in the journal, in the newspapers in Toronto. And that became rather difficult for them. I really wasn't exposed to that as a kid growing up, but the rest of the family definitely was, and right, because he was in the news so much. And so my mom, Elma Rush, who his youngest sister at the time, used to tell me great tales about Myer and about her other, her brothers, Dave, who was a legend, in the book. Dave stands out, a legend in Toronto. He promoted the first heavyweight championship fight to ever be brought into Canada.
Wow.
Myers. So I heard these tales growing up. I heard about Myer. I used to hear that Myer, loved children, and he was extremely wealthy, and he was very tough, and he was very smart. But I didn't ever really know or hear the stuff that Myer would later tell me, right, in those interviews that we had together. Right. Interesting, quick little story. I mean, my mom once told me a story about how, the brothers, the whole family, they all became pretty darn well known, the Rush name in Toronto in the later 20s and 30s. And she went to a school. She was the last to come along. And there was a teacher by the name of Mr. Cass. This is a funny little story that my mom used to tell. And, her older brother went through Mr. Cass, tough brother. Dave went through Mr. Cass, obviously tough. Myer went through, Mr. Cass, obviously tough. And then years went, and the sisters went through. And years later, all of a sudden, there's this little girl, in the classroom, and and she's in Mr. Cass's classroom. And right, this is the story my mom would tell as a kid. And she goes up and she goes up on the blackboard and she writes, and this is a family show, so I'm not going to use the last word.
I remember this from the book. Yeah.
Go ahead. She writes, Cass, kiss my blank, right?
Right.
And he goes over to her and he says, "What is your name, young lady?" And she says, "Alma." And he says, "What's your last name?" She says, "Rush." And he says, "Oh no, not another one." So that was one of the things that I heard as a child growing up.
I mean, and no doubt, I mean, it sounds like there was a lot happening in the Rush home from what I read in your book.
Yes.
So Myer, from the sounds of it, I mean, he grew up he was born in the 20s, correct?
Right. Grew up during the Depression.
according to the book, he was already thieving by the age of 4. Like, is that really even true? Possible?
Yeah. Well, what would happen is he was a child. They would, as as he described, which is in the book, he would call it boosting.
Right.
And he would, and there was some of the older neighborhood kids, he was
Right.
small enough to fit in through the windows, and if they had rails, he could fit in between them. He'd go in and steal, the rooms blind.
Right.
He'd come back and give it to the kids. Here's the thing, though. I think this is what is a major theme in Myer, is that, and the Depression era, is that he always wanted to keep a little bit of that money to give to his mother. He would, so he would steal, and from those, even from that age, and he would give a little bit to Ma all the time.
Right.
The way Myer told it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that was actually very nice. He seemed to have a really warm relationship with his mother. I mean, considering, he was a gangster.
Yes.
Now, I mean, let's get to the.
Well, he wouldn't define himself as a gangster,
right?
Because he didn't think he was a member of a gang. But
that's the interesting thing. So, I mean, when you say gangster, I mean, we have like this mob mentality.
Yeah.
But I mean, he was, and again, what I love about the way you described your uncle is, he was a very complicated guy. I mean, so he was a criminal. He spent time in jail. I mean, I want to get to the bombing in his bed because it's the headline. But he also felt that he was kind of a hero of the people in a weird
I think he
way.
saw himself as sort of a Robin Hood kind of guy,
right?
Where he was willing to take on the establishment.
Right.
He didn't like the establishment. He thought he didn't like rules. Obviously, he didn't like regulations, and in those days, they didn't have a lot of. I mean, they were writing the rules in those days. I mean, there were so many things that happened later that were written because of characters like Myer. I mean, I think Michael Milken. Remember in the 80s? Right. I mean, he got away with so much. I mean, eventually they wrote rules to go after him, but I mean, he thought he was exploiting rules that didn't exist. I mean, way back in those days, there were not a lot of rules. I mean, and so they had to write them because of people like Myer.
So tell us in your words, like some of his, like the highlights of some of his, let's call them for argument's sake, criminal, because that's what they were, criminal exploits. I mean, give us the gamut of what he did.
Well, from a young age, he, well, I mean, there are various characters that come into the book, right? I mean, there's Chucky the Scar Wilson.
Right.
Chucky the Scar Wilson teaches Myer how to work the sting. And Myer spoke like a character out of Damon Runyon. I mean, one of those characters that Guys and Dolls, right? and so Myer. The guy would teach Myer how to work the sting. They called it taking the working the back end, or going into people that had a lot of money, that worked in companies or that ran their businesses, and telling them that he had the back end of Big Fat Herky, and we were going to screw Herky, pardon my language.
Right.
So he would use that against the little man that he was on the in, and then turn around and work a sting on him. Well, this particular, and Myer apparently made the guy asked Myer, apparently Myer thought Myer was a tough and smart looking kid. Myer actually had done newspaper. Had a newspaper stand when he was a kid, and really, I mean, a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of things going on in those days where kids want to push Myer out of the way, take over his corner, and get out of here, kike sort of thing. And Myer, that's the way Myer described it. And Myer got tough, and he learned to double over some of those guys. And so as he got a little bit older, this guy Chucky recognized that the guy was a tough guy, and taught and said to Myer, "Do you know what a schmuck is?" And Myer says, "Yeah, I know what a schmuck is," and says, "Can you recognize a schmuck?" And Myer said, "Sure, I can recognize." And I don't know how old Myer was at this time; must have been 12 or 11 or something. "Yeah, I can recognize a schmuck," and he taught Myer how to do this thing.
Right.
So then that guy introduced Myer to a guy named I can't remember, Graham Kellen.
Right.
Actually, I changed the name, but in
Right.
the book, there's in a lot of places I leave the names as they are, and a few places I change them. So Graham Kellen, Myer would then go in and he became a cat burglar. He'd go into rooms and while they were asleep, he'd steal. So Graham taught Myer. This is during the Depression. Graham taught Myer how to make a master key. And so once Myer learned how to make it, because Graham had this invention, because so many hotels had, one master key that could. So once Myer was able to learn how to make the master key, no hotel room was safe.
Right.
Anywhere he went, so those are the and then he made a friend called Freddie Johnson, who used to his big thing was vacation trailers, whatever you call them, RVs,
right,
whatever you call them. In those days, I can't remember what they were called, but so he would steal RVs and go across, and he loved traveling in these RVs. So he would steal them in one state or province and bring them into another state or province and sell them, and just keep doing it across state or provincial lines. These are the kinds of characters that he met. Then one more thing. There was a guy that he met on a train across the country called Rusty Stokes. That is his real name, Rusty Stokes. Rusty Stokes was a kid from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, a tough kid, a Southern boy. Myer met him, on the rails, and they developed a really deep friendship, and Myer loved him. It was like kind of a Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually the guy found drugs, heroin, and wound up overdosing. And that's one thing. When he saw that the guy was into drugs, that's one thing Myer would not have.
Right.
And then sadly, he realized later that the kid had overdosed. So these are some of the stories.
Now, he was kind of he just he pulled off some big, so much bigger heists and criminal activity. At some point he had quite a bit of money. You mentioned that.
Yes, he did.
He had enough to buy his own plane. If he needed. Were they a bunch of little scams, or were some really big things they ended up?
Well, a very good question. I love the journalist in you. Very good question. He eventually discovered, and this leads to some of the later events, the bombing and the baseball bat beating, which I'd like to tell you about.
Yes, please.
So he learned how to, he was very, very hypnotic. He was an incredible salesman. I could tell in interviewing him what kind of salesman he was. He just sold me on all these stories. But he was an incredible salesman, and he wound up meeting people actually through his older brother Dave, meeting people that were in the stock business, stock promotion business, and they found that Myer could really promote stock. And so, and that's where the rules and regulations thing, they were there and they weren't there and they were there. There were things that didn't really govern some of these mining companies, I gather, because I'm not party to it, but Myer learned how to promote all of these stocks and made a mint promoting these stocks, and made and then he'd promote them and run up the stocks, and he would be given shares to do it, and he'd make a mint on it. Other things he made a lot of money on were some really interesting little things. Myer says, and various people did corroborate at the time, that he across the United States and parts of Canada, he learned how he put the signs on the top of taxi cabs. So he promoted this whole taxi cab signage business that made him a lot of money.
Right.
So he discovered in going to the Caribbean. A little sip of water, one sec.
Yeah, of course.
He discovered in going into the Caribbean a wonder sex herb that he called Pago Palo.
Oh, right. I was curious about that. Okay.
And he said that it worked, and they came back and they marketed it in every brochure that he could find in all the big magazines at the time. and money just came pouring in because he would say something like, this 80-year-old guy, could get it up because of this Pago Paulo and get a testimonial from him and all that stuff, right? So he made a mint between the mining companies and the, and let's face it, he made a lot of money just through his, cat burglary, but he would spend the thing that Myer always did is whatever he made, he spent.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you say at one point he didn't believe in saving, like saving for rainy days, not something that was a core value of his.
Exactly.
He just lived for the moment.
Exactly. Right? He was a kid of the Depression.
Right.
He had nothing. He thought that these were Myer's words. I have nothing. I had nothing. There's always, I'm going to get more tomorrow. I can always get more tomorrow. What am I going to save for? Right. I'll just get more tomorrow.
That seemed to work for him. I mean, he was constantly getting more. So let's go up. Let's lead up to the bombing in his bed. Tell us about that, because that's really. I mean, that's
yeah, powerful stuff. Well, and this is where it gets into things that in the book I create. Let's just call it creative nonfiction. In the book, I create different scenarios and conversations that are fictional, but they're based on what he tells me exactly happened. And I kind of tied together different things, that I conjectured based upon what he was telling me, but I can't say that they were real, although he said they were. And, there's no way I could ever really know.
Right.
But we do know he was bombed in his bed, and we do know he survived it. And I'll get to that in a minute, but leading up to, and we know some other so it seemed that because of all this stock promotion and, manipulation and control, there were a number of people that wanted in on that business.
Yeah. And
he didn't want to. This is Myer Rush. Nobody was going to move in on Myer Rush. Nobody.
Right.
Okay. This is Myer. I mean, he once said to me, I think it comes in at the end of the book, Brucey, he says, my biggest fear, he used to call me Brucey, not my biggest fear, my biggest weakness, he said, is that I've never known fear. He said, I've never known the emotion of fear. I don't know what it feels like to have fear. That's what he used to tell me. And that's in the book. And that was rather fascinating to me. How could somebody not know fear? And I probed him on that. I said, of course you did. Of course you knew fear. No, Brucey, I never knew fear. So people, he would try to move in on him and weren't successful. And he was making a lot of money, and I'm not going to say who it was that moved in. I mean, according to Myer, it came from different sides. It came from the people that worked for him. It came from organized crime. It came from the government itself. Right. According to him, that were in cahoots with the organized crime. And there were people that wanted higher office, maybe as high as prime minister, that were interested in putting him away, according to what Myer said. Right. Fascinating stuff. And you could conjecture that there might have been some truth to that. So, so what happens is people want in on his business. Of course, this is all, I just want to keep stressing, I fictionalize this. I do not know any of this. I want to just document. I don't know this to be true, but Myer's not alive anymore. So, but one thing, there are various things that did happen that are documented and they're in the newspapers and they're well known, and they became the stuff of kind of legend. People broke into, several months before he was bombed in his bed, people broke into his home in Toronto. Yeah. Beat him. If they wanted to kill, I asked him if they were trying to kill me. He says, if they wanted to kill me, they could have killed me. So obviously they didn't want to kill me. They just wanted to knock out my faculties so I couldn't talk, or so I'd be brain dead. Well, apparently they were not successful. They beat him across, they bludgeoned him across the arms and the legs and the head. And he had, it brutalized him and had stitches and everywhere, And so there was, it was brought, it was in the newspapers and in the book, there are copies of those little articles that we got the right to put in there. They went to try to find the guys, and they wound up finding enough people to put in a lineup, right? So they bring Myer in to ask him if he can identify any of these people. And so Myer is behind a glass, and he says, I really can't see very well. Can you let me come up, in front of them? And they let him. So
Really?
they let him. And he walks from one end of the line to the other end of the line and walks back and stops in front of a guy, taller, full head of hair, the way he described it. Myer was already losing his hair, so he described him as having a full head of hair and sort of darker complected. And he bends down as if to tie his shoe, and he comes up and absolutely cold cocks the guy and knocks him flat against a wall. Blood splatters, knocks him out, and the policeman says, "So do we have a positive identification?" And Myer walks out of the room, just says, "I don't tell no tales," and he walks out. That was that's the story that just I'll never forget.
So, I mean, did it ever come to light, like no one ever was really discovered to have bombed him?
Okay, so leading up, exactly.
Right.
So leading up to the bombing, Myer was accused of what was considered at the time the biggest crime in the century in Canada, or in the world, $100 million stock fraud.
Right.
People were trying to put him away they never found anything that ever amounted to anything like that.
Right.
And this is where, I conjecture what was going on. So, but they did find a check, from not a Canadian, but from an American, I gather, a check for some amount of money. And so they used that to try to get, from what I hear, gauge further into what he might have done. And they took the net worth of everything he promoted or something. And they said it was $100 million, although they only found a check for several $1,000s on him.
Right.
So he was going to stand trial in this $100 million stock fraud in Toronto. And on the eve of it happening, he's staying at the Sutton Place Hotel, which now, it became eventually condos, but it was really posh at the time, right? Really posh in 1967. It was like privileged and elitist to be able to stay there. So he stayed there. He went to a wedding apparently earlier that day. He comes back and he notices, but doesn't think anything of it, that the TV is on. So, but it's, so he turns it down or whatever. He gets undressed, he goes to bed, and it's something like, and there was also a note saying, I made up your room for you or something, or I turned on the TV for you or something like that. Right. And he goes to bed, and something like 3:45 in the morning, the bomb explodes under his, in his bed and blows him up.
Right.
It blows up windows across the street. It blows off doors down the hallway. It turns out that the bed he's sleeping on, which was a Beauty Rest mattress, the stuffing of that bed, the bed itself was made by his brother-in-law.
That's
astonishing.
It's crazy.
Astonishing. Yeah. And so the police come, they all come. Apparently he gets up, he opens the door, walks on his own power, opens the door, collapses. Now, what's interesting here is, well, at this time, as I say, I was born in Canada, came to California when I was younger. When I was young, we moved back to Canada for a couple of years.
Right.
We moved to Montreal, and then for a year we moved to New Brunswick, Campbellton, New Brunswick, way up on the Bay of, way up there on the Bay of Chaleur, freezing place for a California boy by way of Canada.
I can imagine.
So my mom comes to get me from class. I'm in 6th grade. She brings us home, and she picks us up at school, and she's white as a ghost. She says her brother had just been killed by a time bomb, and that she is flying to Toronto, and she's arranging for me and my dad. She wasn't going to leave us with my dad, but she was going to leave us with some neighbors. He had to work, and she was arranging to get us set up with some neighbors. During the time that I'm home waiting for her, and she's talking to her sister Sarah in Toronto, the phone rings, and Sarah says, "Guess what? I hear that he's still alive." She turns on the radio. Now, I kid you not, this is what I hear. I hear it myself, which is like astonishing. She turns on the radio, and they say on this is National Canadian Radio. They say, "We bring you the story. We want to interrupt this to tell you about it. The Myer Rush, Toronto stock promoter, on the night of before testifying $100 million stock fraud, the biggest one in Canada, was blown up and died. Okay, it died overnight. More details to come." Literally, I hear that, and I hear the following. 15, 20 minutes later, shortly, almost immediately after the call from my mom's sister, I hear, "We want to update this report on the bombing and death of Myer Rush. We believe, we're told that he is alive, and he's been given a 20% chance of survival. More details to come." I hear this. Later that night, my mom flies to Toronto. It's just like astonishing. So then he eventually makes his way to Panama, where he owns land and jungle land, and he's protected by the Panamanian government. And that's where the Toronto newspaper, what was it, the Star, whatever one it was, finds him there. And Sylvia Fraser, the noted, famous, talented journalist, happens to bump into him with her photographer, and they do a story which then appeared on the front page. And of course, there's a photo in the book on the front page of the Toronto Star Weekly.
Right.
Him in Panama with his foot on a Jeep and his neck just sliced open. Oof. And she describes the story of interviewing him, which was a very colorful story.
I meas we kind of touched on earlier, Myer didn't consider himself a criminal. He didn't consider himself a bad guy. I mean, what he didn't save. I mean, what were his justifications for doing what he did?
Interesting question. I was going to title the book at one point, "I Stole an Apple Maw," The Legend of Myer Rush. I changed it later.
Yeah.
Because there's an event when he was very young, when he was hungry.
Right.
And he stole an apple. And the guy caught him and said, and turned him in. And so he had a record.
Right.
And from a young age. And the mother was called to the police station and said, "What did you do, Myer?" He said, "I stole an apple, Ma. I was hungry." And so I think he saw his life as, you know what? I'm going to go out and steal some apples from time to time because I'm hungry. I grew up in the Depression. If I get caught, that's the price I'm going to have to pay.
Right.
But I'm going to make it big. I think that's how he saw himself. Some people would say he was a sociopath. Other people would say you're, obviously a career criminal. I mean, all those things are true. You wouldn't like him if you're one of the people that was victimized by him. As his nephew interviewing him, I can tell you he saw himself as a Robin Hood type, as a heroic type, and courageous. And he also, wasn't educated, but he was very smart. And he didn't like the way people would make fun of him. The way he spoke, like out of Guys and Dolls sort of thing.
Right.
So that's who Myer, and yet that probably only tells part of the story. I mean, he was a gangster.
Right.
I mean, you could call him a gangster. But I mean, ultimately, Myer Rush, I mean, the man he literally had no fear.
Right.
Literally. How rare is that?
But I don't know. That must be exceptionally rare.
I think you're seeing it in Ukraine right now.
Possibly, actually, yes.
You're seeing people with fear there. Oh man.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you're right. So what was so tell us about the last time you saw him, and maybe, I mean, it's been
Okay.
yeah.
Really funny. Oh, this is funny. I had just gotten married. My new wife and I, Sue, had gone over to Europe, and Dave was living in London, and Myer was in Amsterdam.
Mm-hmm.
And so Myer had rented this place, and he was started a new business, calling people all over the country, all over wherever he was calling, United States, Canada, whatever, from his place in in Amsterdam. And we wound up staying with him in this place for a few nights.
Mm-hmm.
And so he wanted me to start marketing some of his stuff when I got back to California. I said, no, Myer, I'm not doing that. No, I'm not doing that. He kept trying to tell me to do it. And he said to me, Brucey, this is like almost his last words to me, but and then I saw him several years later for dinner. He was with my mom in LA. He was visiting her very briefly, and we had dinner together. But basically, that was very brief. That he said to me when I wouldn't do this for him in Amsterdam, he said, Brucey, he said, you're a tough nut to crack. That's what he said to me. I said, Myer, I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah, I think I've heard that as a compliment. Well, this has been really insightful. Thank you so much. Again, Bruce Farrell Rosen's book, Bomb in His Bed, Confessions of a Jewish Gangster, Myer Rush, and it's available on Amazon.
I've got to restock Amazon. We sold out of it like a year plus ago, and I haven't restocked it. So perhaps this interview might,
No, you have to restock it now.
I'm going to have to restock it.
All right. Thanks very much, Bruce. And we look forward to hearing more about the future of Myer Rush in our popular culture.
Oh, well, thank you, Ray. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate the good questions.
Oh, it's okay. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Till next time.
Yep.